Hey, super excited to be back with another video. Thank you all for the incredible support. We're pushing hard to hit 10k subscribers next year, and it's all thanks to you. If you're enjoying the content, smash that like button and subscribe to join the journey. Now, let's jump into today's awesome video. The signal came at 3:47 AM on a quiet Tuesday morning in October, though there was nothing special about that time until it became everything. I was half asleep at my monitoring station at the Deep Space Communications Network, fighting to keep my eyes open during another mundane night shift. The soft blue glow of my screens provided the only illumination in the otherwise dark room, casting strange shadows on the walls of discarded coffee cups and forgotten sandwich wrappers. My name is Marcus Chen, and I've spent the last 15 years of my life listening to the whispers of space. Most people don't understand what that means. They think deep space monitoring is exciting, that we're constantly receiving signals from distant civilizations or discovering new phenomena. The reality is far more mundane. Endless hours of static, occasional pings from our active missions, and the constant background radiation of a universe that seems determinedly empty. That night, I was doing what I always did, monitoring multiple frequencies, checking equipment calibrations, and fighting the urge to doze off. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, and I was debating whether it was worth making the trek to the break room for a fresh cup. The gentle hum of equipment filled the room with its familiar lullaby, and the green and red LEDs blinked their usual patterns. Everything was normal, until it wasn't. The first sign that something was wrong came when my primary monitoring system suddenly rebooted. I remember cursing under my breath, thinking I'd lost hours of routine data collection. But when the system came back online, every monitor in the room lit up simultaneously, flooding the dark space with an intense, almost painful brightness. The readings made no sense at first. Signal strength off the charts, frequency patterns that seemed to shift and change even as I watched them, and a signature that tugged at my memory like a half-forgotten dream. My hands trembled as I pulled up our archive of probe signatures, a database I knew better than my own heartbeat. The match was undeniable. Voyager 6, a deep space probe we'd launched in 1993 and lost contact with in the early 2000s, was broadcasting again. But that wasn't the most impossible thing. According to the readings, it was close. Impossibly close. The signal strength suggested it was already within our solar system, moving at speeds that defied everything we knew about physics. I spent 20 minutes verifying the data, running every diagnostic I knew. Each test confirmed what I was seeing. This wasn't a glitch or a malfunction. This was real. My finger hovered over the emergency contact button for a full minute before I finally pressed it. Some part of me knew that by making that call, I was crossing a line. There would be no going back to the comfortable boredom of routine monitoring after this. The phone rang 4 times before Dr. Sarah Chen answered. Her voice was thick with sleep, but she caught the urgency in my tone immediately. "Marcus, what's wrong?" "Dr. Chen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need you to come to the station. Now. It's about Voyager 6. There was a long pause on the line. "Voyager 6 has been silent for decades." "Not anymore," I replied, "and Dr. Chen, it's coming back." Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at the station 28 minutes later, a new record for the usual 40-minute drive from her home. Her silver-streaked hair was hastily pulled back in a messy bun, and she wore mismatched shoes, one black loafer and one navy blue. But her eyes were sharp and alert. I'd known her for over a decade, worked with her on countless projects, but I'd never seen her like this. There was an intensity in her expression that bordered on fear. She'd been the original project lead for Voyager 6, and the probe's disappearance had haunted her career. I'd heard rumours that she'd spent years fighting to maintain funding for listening posts specifically tuned to its frequency, long after everyone else had written it off as lost. Looking at her now, I wondered if she'd known something the rest of us hadn't. "Show me everything," she demanded, pulling up a chair next to me. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, with practiced precision, pulling up data streams and analysis windows faster than I could track. I watched her expression change as she absorbed the information, from excitement to confusion, then to something approaching fear. "This can't be right," she muttered, running the calculations again. Her hands were shaking slightly as she input the commands. "According to these readings, it's already within our solar system. The speed it's traveling." She trailed off, her face pale in the blue light of the monitors. I pulled up the trajectory analysis I'd been working on. "It's not just the speed, Dr. Chen. Look at the path it's taking." I highlighted the probe's course on the main screen. "These aren't natural movements. It's making course corrections, deliberate ones." She leaned in closer, her breath fogging the screen slightly. "The energy readings are impossible. It's putting out more power than we equipped it with, by several orders of magnitude. And these frequency patterns." She pointed to a scrolling graph of wave formations. "They're structured, complex, almost like..." "Like what?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. "Like language," she whispered. "But not any language we programmed it to understand." She sat back in her chair, running her hands through her hair. "Call Director Matthews. Use the emergency line. Tell him..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Tell him we have a potential first contact situation." "First contact?" I felt my mouth go dry. "You think there's someone controlling the probe?" She turned to look at me, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before, a mixture of wonder and terror. "Marcus, I don't think that's our probe anymore. At least, not entirely." She turned back to the screens, her fingers resuming their dance across the keyboard. "Marcus, don't share this with anyone else yet. Not until we understand what we're dealing with." The next hour was a blur of activity. We ran every analysis we could think of, tested every frequency, checked and double-checked our readings. With each passing minute, the signal grew stronger, and the data became stranger. The probe was undeniably heading toward Earth, but its approach didn't match any orbital mechanics we understood. It moved like something alive, something purposeful. The sun was just beginning to rise when Director Matthews arrived. His usual immaculate appearance, showing signs of haste, his tie slightly askew, and his normally perfectly pressed suit wrinkled from the rushed drive. He wasn't alone. Behind him came a parade of specialists, each carrying tablets and laptops, their faces a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The quiet monitoring station transformed into a hub of frenzied activity within minutes. Temporary workstations sprouted across every available surface, and the air filled with the sound of urgent conversations and humming equipment. Every agency wanted in, NASA, ESA, even the military, sent representatives, their uniforms, a stark contrast to the casual attire of the scientists. Dr. Emily Santos arrived shortly after, a reputation as our leading expert in xenobiology preceding her. She moved through the chaos with deliberate grace, her dark eyes taking in everything. She'd spent her career preparing for the possibility of alien life, though I doubt even she had imagined it would come riding back to Earth on one of our own probes. "The mass readings are what concern me most," she announced during our first briefing, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversations. The conference room was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls. "The probe's mass has increased by a factor of 3 since launch, and that's a conservative estimate." She pulled up a series of complex graphs on the main screen. "But it's not just the mass. The composition is unprecedented. We're picking up organic compounds that shouldn't exist in space, molecular structures that defy our understanding of chemistry. It's as if the probe has been rebuilt at an atomic level." The military representatives exchanged worried glances at that. Colonel Sarah Blackwood, a stern-faced woman with calculating eyes and more combat medals than I could count, took control of the briefing. We need to discuss containment protocols immediately. If this probe has been contaminated with extraterrestrial biological material... Contaminated? Dr. Chen interrupted, rising from her seat. The passion in her voice made everyone turn. This could be first contact. This could be the most significant moment in human history. We need to focus on communication, not containment. And if that communication turns out to be hostile, Colonel Blackwood countered, her voice steel-edged. If whatever changed our probe out there isn't friendly, then we'd better hope we can understand it, Dr. Chen shot back, because if it's hostile, your containment protocols won't mean a damn thing. This probe is moving in ways that defy our physics. Whatever changed it has technology far beyond ours. The argument escalated from there, the room dividing itself along predictable lines. Scientists on one side, military on the other. Director Matthews tried to maintain order, but the tension was palpable. Everyone had an opinion, a theory, a concern to voice. Nobody seemed to notice that I'd stopped paying attention to the argument. My eyes were fixed on my tablet, watching the signal strength readings climb higher and higher. The probe wasn't just approaching, it was accelerating, and with each passing hour, the patterns in its transmissions were becoming more complex, more deliberate. Dr. Santos noticed my distraction and moved to look over my shoulder. Her sharp intake of breath made several nearby people turn. "Those patterns," she whispered. "They're not random. They're fractal, self-replicating, almost like..." "Like what?" Colonel Blackwood demanded. "Like DNA," Santos replied, her voice barely audible. "But not any kind we've ever seen before." The first clear images of Voyager 6 came through during a rare quiet moment in the facility. We'd established a link with the Mars Orbital Telescope, and everyone gathered around the main display screen, holding their breath as the data streamed in. The image resolution was unprecedented. Whatever had happened to the probe seemed to be enhancing our ability to track it. The room fell into a shocked silence as the first images appeared. I heard someone gag, and someone else started praying quietly in the corner. The sleek, silver probe we'd launched 3 decades ago no longer existed. What we saw instead defied explanation. The basic structure was still recognizable, but it had been transformed. Organic-looking growths covered much of the surface, pulsing with an internal light that seemed to follow patterns just complex enough to suggest intelligence. The metal itself had become something else entirely, something that seemed to flow and shift even as we watched. It moved like liquid mercury, but with purpose, reshaping itself in ways that made my eyes hurt. "My God," Dr. Chen whispered, her hand covering her mouth. "What happened to it out there?" Dr. Santos took control of the imaging system, enhancing different sections of the probe. Her usual calm demeanor cracked slightly as she worked. "These growths," she explained, zooming in on one of the iridescent structures. "They're not just attached to the surface, they're integrated with it. The metal itself has been transformed at a molecular level into something new." "New how?" Colonel Blackwood demanded, her military bearing slipping slightly as she stared at the impossible images. "New as in never seen before on Earth," Santos replied. She pulled up a molecular analysis. "The atomic structure doesn't match anything in our databases. It's like the probe evolved, but not in any way we understand evolution. These structures, they're both organic and inorganic simultaneously. They're alive, but they're also machine, and they're still changing, still adapting, even as we watch." Dr. Chen moved closer to the screen, her eyes fixed on a particular section of the transformed probe. "There," she pointed to what had once been the communication array. "It's still using some of our original technology, but it's integrated it into whatever it's become. like it kept what was useful and transformed the rest. The images continued to stream in, each more unsettling than the last. The probe seemed to be surrounded by a field of distorted space, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt but in 3 dimensions. Occasionally parts of it would shift or flow in ways that seemed to ignore physics entirely, moving through impossible angles and dimensions. Dr. Santos spent hours analysing the footage, making detailed notes and running countless simulations. Her team worked around the clock, trying to understand what they were seeing. The conclusions they reached were disturbing. "It's not just that the probe changed," she explained during an emergency briefing. "It's still changing. The rate of transformation is accelerating. And these energy readings," she showed a graph that curved sharply upward. "It's not just outputting energy. It's creating it. Somehow it's generating more energy than should be possible." Colonel Blackwood's team began drafting contingency plans, but it was clear they were out of their depth. How do you prepare for something that breaks the laws of physics? How do you contain something that can reshape reality itself? Late that night, as I was reviewing the footage for the 100th time, I noticed something no one else had caught. In one frame, just for a fraction of a second, part of the probe's surface formed into what looked like an eye, a very human eye, and it was looking directly at the camera. I never reported that observation. Some truths are too disturbing to share. As Voyager 6 entered the inner solar system, its effects became more pronounced. The first incident occurred at a radio telescope array in Chile. Every piece of equipment within a mile radius suddenly began picking up the same signal, a complex, rhythmic pattern that caused several researchers to experience intense migraines and vivid hallucinations. Dr. Santos led the investigation into these effects. "It's not just electromagnetic radiation," she explained during an emergency conference call. "The probe is emitting something else, something we don't have instruments to properly measure. It seems to interact directly with conscious minds." The International Space Station reported the next anomaly. Commander Sarah Mitchell's voice was steady but strained as she described what the crew was experiencing. "The dream started 3 nights ago," she reported. "At first, we thought it was stress or cosmic radiation affecting our sleep patterns. But we're all having the same dream. We see vast structures in space, geometries that shouldn't be possible, and we hear music, but not like any music on Earth." Their equipment started malfunctioning next. Crucial systems would shut down without warning, only to restart minutes later, operating more efficiently than before. The station's computers began displaying strange symbols that didn't match any known language but somehow felt meaningful to the crew. Back on Earth, the military's attempts to track the probe were proving futile. Their most advanced targeting systems couldn't lock onto it. Colonel Blackwood grew increasingly frustrated as each attempt failed. "It's like trying to aim at a quantum particle," one technician explained. "The more precisely we try to locate it, the more uncertain its position becomes. It's as if it exists in multiple states simultaneously." Dr. Chen spent countless hours in her makeshift command center attempting to communicate with the probe. She used every protocol we'd ever developed, every frequency we could generate. The walls were covered with printouts of signal patterns and mathematical equations. "It's still using parts of its original communication system," she insisted during one late-night session. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, but they burned with determination. "There must be something left of what we built, some way to reach it." On the 13th day of her attempts, the probe responded. The signal it sent back fried half our equipment and left the other half fundamentally altered. The machines that survived began operating at impossible levels of efficiency. Their processing power increased by orders of magnitude. When we finally decoded the message, it was our own first transmission to the probe, sent decades ago, Godspeed, Voyager 6. But it was distorted, changed. Hidden within the transmission was something else, a pattern that our computers couldn't decode but that made everyone who heard it feel deeply, inexplicably uneasy. Dr. Santos was the first to notice what the pattern was doing to people. Those who spent too long analysing it began to change in subtle ways. Their movement became more precise, their thought patterns more alien. Some reported seeing colours that didn't exist, hearing frequencies beyond human perception. It's not just a message, she warned. It's changing us, preparing us. Preparing us for what? Director Matthews asked. Before she could answer, every screen in the facility displayed the same image, a mathematical equation of impossible complexity, one that seemed to describe the transformation of matter itself. And in that moment, we all understood what was coming. The probe wasn't just returning home, it was bringing something with it. The night Voyager 6 entered Earth's atmosphere was unlike anything in recorded history. It began with a complete electromagnetic blackout that spread like a wave across the globe. Cell phones displayed strange, shifting symbols before going dark. Satellites fell silent. Power grids fluctuated wildly, creating auroras visible even at the equator. I watched from the command center as our instruments tried to track its descent. The probe moved with impossible precision, ignoring atmospheric friction and gravitational forces. It was as if it had rewritten the laws of physics around itself. "That's not a controlled descent," Colonel Blackwood muttered, watching the trajectory plots. "That's not even flight. It's reformatting space itself." She was right. The probe wasn't so much flying as it was reshaping reality around itself, creating a corridor of altered space-time that bypassed normal physical laws. Our most advanced tracking systems could barely comprehend what they were seeing. The landing site became obvious hours before the actual touchdown. A section of Death Valley began to crystallize, the sand transforming into complex geometric patterns that spread outward in fractal spirals. Wildlife fled the area in masses. Birds, insects, even the bacteria in the soil seemed to sense what was coming. When Voyager 6 finally landed, it didn't crash or impact. It simply arrived. One moment the space was empty, the next it was occupied. The sand beneath it transmuted instantly into a material that resembled glass but behaved like a living thing, growing and shifting in patterns that matched the probe's pulsing lights. I was part of the first approach team, along with Dr. Chen and Dr. Santos. We wore the most advanced hazmat suits ever designed, equipped with independent air supplies and radiation shielding. They felt about as useful as paper bags against whatever we were approaching. The closer we got, the more reality seemed to blur. Colours existed that our eyes couldn't properly process. Sounds overlapped in impossible ways. The air itself felt thick with potential, like the moment before a lightning strike. Dr. Chen took point. Her instruments extended before her like divining rods. The readings they gave made no sense. Radiation levels that should have been lethal but somehow weren't. Energy signatures that changed faster than our devices could measure. Quantum states that shouldn't have been possible outside of theoretical physics. The probe itself had grown larger since the Mars images. The organic mechanical fusion had continued, creating structures that hurt to look at directly. The surface rippled like liquid mercury, and those strange growths now resembled organs from some impossible biology, pulsing beneath membranes that seemed to exist in more dimensions than we could perceive. "The atomic structure," Dr. Santos whispered, staring at her readings. "It's not just different, it's evolving, changing even as we watch. The matter itself is becoming something new." She was right. Through our instruments, we could see the transformation spreading outward from the probe like a wave, altering everything it touched at the quantum level. The sand, the air, even the light behaved differently within its radius of influence. That's when we heard it, the humming. It started as a low vibration just at the edge of perception, But it quickly became something more. Something that bypassed our ears entirely and resonated directly with our consciousness. Each of us experienced it differently, and for me, it felt like whispers in a language I almost understood, like memories of conversations I hadn't had yet. Dr. Chen described it as music played in mathematical equations. Dr. Santos said it reminded her of coral reefs growing in time-lapse, but as sound. 2 members of our team removed their helmets, drawn by something they claimed to see in the probe's shifting surface. Before we could stop them, they walked forward, their movements becoming increasingly fluid and precise, less and less human. They crossed the transformation boundary, and we lost contact with base camp at that point. Our communications equipment had transformed into something else entirely, something that hummed in harmony with the probe. But we didn't need radio contact to know what was happening. We could feel it. Something vast and ancient had followed our probe home, and it had plans for us. The transformation began slowly at first, almost beautifully. The 2 team members who crossed the boundary didn't die. They transcended. Their bodies became living art, shifting between states of matter like liquid light. Their eyes reflected universes we couldn't comprehend, and when they spoke, reality rippled around their words. Dr. Chen was the next to change. I watched my mentor's transformation over the course of 6 hours, unable to help, unable to look away. It started with her eyes. They became pools of shifting mercury, reflecting light that didn't exist in our dimension. Her skin developed a metallic sheen that moved like oil on water, and her movements became too precise, too fluid for human joints and muscles. Before she completely changed, she told me what she'd learned. Her voice took on harmonic overtones that made my teeth vibrate and my vision blur. But I understood enough. The truth was both simpler and more terrifying than we'd imagined. "We were never alone, Marcus," she said, her voice resonating at frequencies that made reality flicker. "The universe is alive with intelligence, but not in ways we could perceive. Our probe, it wasn't just exploring. It was like a child's drawing hung on a cosmic refrigerator. They saw it, and they saw us, and they decided to help us grow." Her skin had begun to ripple like the surface of the probe. "They're not hostile, they're curious, nurturing even. They want to help us evolve. The universe is so much stranger and more beautiful than we ever imagined, and they want to share it with us." Those were the last words she spoke that I could fully comprehend. After that, her speech became a complex symphony of harmonics that restructured the air itself into patterns of meaning too complex for my unchanged mind to grasp. The military response was both swift and spectacularly futile. They tried everything: conventional weapons, experimental sonic devices, even nuclear options were discussed. Nothing worked. The transformed matter simply absorbed everything they threw at it, growing stronger and more complex with each attempt. The quarantine zone expanded daily, the boundary between what was human and what was becoming something else, advancing like an iridescent tide. The changed ones moved with impossible grace through altered spaces, their bodies flickering between states of matter as they spread their gift of transformation. Cities near the quarantine zone began to empty, but not everyone fled. Some went toward it, drawn by promises of evolution and transcendence. They called themselves the Embraced and spoke of visions and communications with something vast and infinite. Their eyes shone within a light as they described what waited beyond the boundary of human consciousness. The president's attempt at martial law in 3 states collapsed when members of the military began to change, their weapons transforming into sculptures of impossible beauty, their tactics evolving into dances of quantum probability. The stock market crashed, then transcended economics entirely, as changed ones introduced concepts of value that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. That was 2 weeks ago. The transformation has spread across continents now. The changed ones have begun building something in every major city-vast structures that exist partially in dimensions we can't perceive, geometries that map the progression of consciousness across multiple planes of existence. They say they're preparing for the arrival of others, of the ones who change them. They speak in frequencies that restructure reality, describing a universe so vast and strange and beautiful that merely comprehending it begins the process of transformation. Last night I noticed my reflection wasn't quite synced with my movements. The mirror showed me possibilities rather than actualities, versions of myself that existed in quantum superposition. And this morning, I could hear it, the humming that started everything, the frequency that reshapes matter and consciousness. My skin has begun to ripple like liquid starlight. I can see colours that exist between and beyond the spectrum, hear the quantum dance of electrons, feel the pull of dimensions that fold through our reality like pages in an infinite book. I understand now what Dr. Chen meant. We're not being invaded or replaced. We're being awakened. Our probes weren't just exploring space. They were showing higher intelligences that we were ready to join them, ready to evolve beyond the constraints of three-dimensional space and linear time. As I write these final words, my fingers leave trails of probability across the keyboard, each keystroke splitting reality into multiple potential futures. The humming is everywhere now, a cosmic lullaby teaching us how to transcend our limited existence. We were never alone in the universe. We just weren't ready to perceive what was always there, waiting for us to grow beyond our cradle. Our probes weren't just measuring space. They were mapping the path of our species' metamorphosis. The transformation is beautiful, terrible, inevitable. We are becoming something that exists in the spaces between moments, in the folds between dimensions. Not human, not alien, something in between, something new. Can you hear the humming? Can you see the colors that shouldn't exist? Can you feel reality reshaping itself around you? It's beginning. It's beautiful. It's time. We are all going to change.